It's time for me to introduce our honorary chair for the evening, a political figure who has gained the respect and admiration of politicians of all parties. He's the former and, of course, as I think everyone knows, the longest ever serving Speaker of the House of Commons, former Member of Parliament for Kingston and the Islands, an honor he shares, of course, with one of our two namesakes, Sir John A. Macdonald. He's now a fellow at the School of Public Policy at Queen's University. We're proud to welcome for the fourth time in a row a figure who has earned the highest esteem of his former colleagues and indeed his fellow Canadians for his integrity and fairness. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Honourable Peter Milliken, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and I'm delighted to have the privilege of introducing to you our speakers this evening. They're going to carry on a discussion. I wouldn't call it a debate, but it's certainly a discussion. And I'm honored to have the privilege to introduce first to you the Honourable James Moore. Mr. Moore was born in New Westminster, raised in Coquitlam, and resides in Port Moody. He has had a distinguished career. On November 27th, 2000, he was elected to represent the constituency of Port Moody, Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam, as its representative in the Parliament of Canada at the tender age of 24 years of age. And at the time, that was the youngest MP that had ever been elected from British Columbia. Since then, of course, he's been re-elected many times. He's been very active during his days in opposition as a member in question period. In fact, I'm told that in his first term he asked more questions in question period than any other MP who was not a current or former party leader. Also, in his first term, he was named the best up-and-coming MP 4 years in a row by fellow parliamentarians and Parliament Hill staffers who made this selection. I suspect so. He was re-elected in the 2004 general election for the electoral district of Port Moody, Westwood, Port Coquitlam, and he, of course, served in the opposition after that. On January 23rd, 2006, he was re-elected for his third term as the Member of Parliament for the same riding, Port Moody, Westwood, Port Coquitlam. They changed the name a bit, but he was, of course, appointed to the post of Parliamentary Secretary to different cabinet ministers until 2008, when he was made the Secretary of State for the 2010 Olympics, the Asia-Pacific Gateway, and official languages. He's the youngest minister also in BC history, and the fourth youngest minister in Canadian history as a result of those appointments. In October 2008, he was re-elected again for another term in Parliament, and on October 30th of that year, 2008, Mr. Harper appointed James to be the Minister of Canadian Heritage and Official Languages. He was also responsible for the 2010 Olympic and Paralympic Games. On May the 2nd, 2011, James was re-elected as the Member of Parliament for the same riding for his fifth term, the first five-term MP in his community. And on July 15th, 2013, he was appointed Minister of Industry, a post he still holds to this day. So, we're honored to welcome as our first presenter this evening the Honourable James Moore, who I'm sure you will enjoy hearing from in this discussion.
Thank you.
Sir James.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for the exhaustive and generous introduction.
You gave me 5 minutes, I figured it.
Exactly. Yeah, whenever I get sometimes an introduction that's as generous as that, I remind people that it shows that not all forms of inflation are painful, so thank you. First, I want to thank the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. You know, we do not have enough institutes of this caliber and quality across this country who step up to the mandate that you've imposed on yourself, which is to enrich public policy and also to bring forward people to talk about things like this, which is Canada's history. You know, as we're on the cusp of Canada's 150th birthday, it's really important that we take moments and we think about Canada's rich past, the heroes of the past, the remarkable things that they overcame in order to build this great and beautiful country. And so evenings like today are really great. So thank you to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And before I talk about who I believe is Canada's best Prime Minister, I want to talk to you about one of the people who I think has been one of my most esteemed and accomplished colleagues in the House of Commons, and that's Irwin Cotler, who last week gave us the news that he's not going to be seeking re-election in the next campaign. You know, Irwin and I were elected at about the same time, him in '99, I was elected in 2000. You know, Gerald Ford once talked about politics, and he described it like a hammock. As he said, getting into politics is like getting into a hammock. It looks really fun and it's great, and while you're there, it can be really comfortable. But it's very difficult to exit gracefully. And so it is true with politics as well. But Irwin, you've accomplished that, and I'm happy for you. A friend of mine who, when I decided to run for office back in 2000, he said, I prayed for you on the day of the election. And I said, well, what'd you pray for, that I would win or not? And he said, no, I prayed that whatever happened on election night would be in your best interest. So I think I speak on behalf of everybody in the room, Irwin, that I know that the decision that you've made is in your best interest, and I'm very happy for you for that. So. So my choice this evening, I was asked to say who I think Canada's best Prime Minister is, and for me, quite frankly, it's crystal clear that it is indeed Sir John A. Macdonald. You know, he was truly the father of Canada's Confederation. He brought PEI into the Canadian family, he established the Northwest Territories, Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and absolutely, very clearly, most importantly, brought British Columbia into the Canadian family. He built the railway, which indeed brought us together as a country. And by the way, we just sort of throw that out, and you hear school kids say that. Well, Macdonald's the guy who built the railway. It's sort of like saying Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Well, actually, there's a tremendous amount that went into that accomplishment. And it was crazy at the time, the idea of building a railway from central Canada to where? And again, at the time of building the railway from central Canada to the province of British Columbia, there were about 20,000 or so British Columbians of European descent. Just in the same year, about the same year that the railway was being built from central Canada out to British Columbia, the Americans completed their railway from Chicago to San Francisco, uniting the Midwest of the United States with 4 million people in San Francisco. And building the railway across this country was far more challenging. And they said, you're never going to get through the Shield, you're never going to punch through the Rockies, you're never going to make it across the Selkirks. Why in the world would you get there anyway? But he saw the vision, recognized the threat of the Americans from the War of 1812, and said, if we don't reach all the way to the Pacific coast, this country will not long survive. He had the vision, he understood. The country almost went broke in establishing that vision, but he made it happen, and this country endures. His national policy protected Canada's early fragile economy and protected us from the United States. He created the Northwest Mounted Police. And by the way, he did all of this. He did all of this with no predecessor. There was no role model to learn from. He didn't know. We borrowed institutions that we knew that would be great and that would serve Canada well. But to be a Prime Minister and to lead this divided country, there was no model to follow. You couldn't look at previous Prime Ministers and say, well, that worked and that didn't, and given these times, I'm going to have that style and that approach. He was the first, and he was the best. But not only did he have the grand vision, because in politics it's not enough just to have a great and grand vision. As Shakespeare says in Measure for Measure, if you will the end, you must will the means. So you can be a great visionary, but you have to be a practical politician to get it done. And we know from Doris Kearns Goodwin's great book, The Team of Rivals, where she talks about Abraham Lincoln and how he drew in all these rivals into his cabinet in order to solidify his administration. Macdonald, too, had as much toughness and guile in establishing this country and solidifying it moving forward. You know, Canada without Sir John A., as I said, would not exist. But upon Confederation, we were indeed very fragile. At the time of Confederation, Upper Lower Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia was by far the bigger of the two provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Halifax rivaled Montreal in size and strength and economic might. Nova Scotia was much more developed and wealthier than was New Brunswick at the time of Confederation. And 3 months after Confederation, same year, 1867, there were elections in the province of Nova Scotia for both the provincial legislature and the upper house, a combined 55 seats. So they just entered Confederation, but there were 55 seats. 52 of the 55 seats went to anti-Confederate separatists who wanted to draw Nova Scotia back out from Confederation. So with facing this, what does Sir John A. Macdonald do? The answer is Joseph Howe. Joseph Howe was a journalist, he was a liberal reformer, and he was a fierce anti-Confederate. First elected to the Nova Scotia legislature in 1836, he helped bring responsible government to Nova Scotia, deeply respected in that province. He was Premier of Nova Scotia from 1860 to 1863. And between 66 and 68, he devoted all of his energies of his life to stopping Nova Scotia from entering into Confederation and stopping Canada from becoming a country. He stoked the fears and the anxieties within the province that led to all those separatists getting elected in Nova Scotia. And he went so far as to appeal directly to England and to try to persuade them directly to repeal the Confederation of Canada. But he lost his fight. Sir John A., knowing that he had won Confederation, but also knowing that the long-term union of Canada was by no means a sure thing, he made a choice. And like Abraham Lincoln, who built his team of rivals, John A. Macdonald directly approached Joseph Howe and personally persuaded him to join his cabinet in the new federal government. Even after all that he had done to thwart the creation of Canada, Howe accepted. Howe became the president of the Queen's Privy Council for Canada. He played a central role in expanding Canada beyond our first 4 provinces, in particular in bringing Manitoba into Confederation, thereby giving Howe a legacy beyond his failed efforts to destroy this country. And more importantly, showing to Nova Scotians that their most trusted statesman could be brought into the Canadian family, and along with him, the province of Nova Scotia, and with that, he cemented Nova Scotia into Canada. Howe was then appointed Lieutenant Governor in Nova Scotia. Sadly, he died 3 months later when he went home to Nova Scotia. But the result of this is how Christopher Moore puts it in his book. He said, quote, "By recruiting Howe, Macdonald tore the heart out of anti-Confederate opposition in Nova Scotia, and he strengthened his own party in the process. His new Liberal Conservatives, who were almost wiped out in the Nova Scotia elections of 1867, the 52 of 55, would themselves sweep back into Nova Scotia in 1872, thereby cementing Nova Scotia into Confederation." So you see, not only was Sir John A. Macdonald a grand visionary, he understood that great ideas and great thematics are of no worth unless you put in the hard work and are practical and tough and sometimes cunning in getting them over the line. So not only was John A. Macdonald a grand visionary, not only was he a practical politician, but this is the one thing that I want to underline most, is his personal strength. You know, Richard Gwynne, when he talked about John A. Macdonald, he said, his personal life makes Job look like a lucky guy. When John A. was a 7-year-old boy, he watched as his 5.5-year-old younger brother, James, was killed by a drunken servant named Kennedy. His wife was an opium addict. She had TB. She became addicted to opium and suffered painfully as a result of that. His firstborn child died of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. You can always imagine that, seeing your child breathless and dealing with that tragedy. His second son lived but grew up alienated from Sir John A. Macdonald. He forever regretted that. He then remarried, and his second daughter, Mary, who was mentally and physically challenged, she was hydrocephalic. He would return home from late sittings in Parliament Hill just behind us almost every night to rock his baby girl to sleep, even though she struggled very painfully. In Richard Gwynne's book, he said, experts at the time said that he was nuts for adoring his daughter because she had a disability and was a political liability. But he ignored people's nasty comments, and he greatly enjoyed spending time with his beautiful daughter. After John A. Macdonald's death, Lady Macdonald and Mary then moved to England, and Mary managed some recovery. She even learned how to type, even though it was painful for her to type on her typewriter, and she lived a joyful life thereafter and forever loved her father because of the way he stood by her. Agnes Macdonald, another tragedy of John A.'s life, is one of his dearest and closest friends. Darcy McGee was shot and killed just a couple blocks away from where we are here. In Agnes Macdonald's diary, his wife's diary, in 1868, here's what she wrote. She said, "This is how it was, that dreadful night. At 2:30 on the Tuesday morning, Tuesday the 7th, my husband came home from a late sitting. I was almost half asleep when I was roused by a low, rapid knocking at the door. In an instant, a great fear came upon me. Springing up, I threw on a wrapper just in time to see John throw up the window and hear him call out, 'Is anything the matter?' The answer came fearfully and quickly to be heard. Darcy McGee is murdered, lying in the street, shot through the head. The words felt and fell like a blow of an iron across my heart. My husband and brother went down to the spot immediately and did not return until 5. I sat trembling with fear and horror. No one could tell me how many more assassins might be lurking in the gray-lit streets to attack John. When John came home, he was much agitated, news coming and going. All were alert of the finding of this base coward who had done this foul deed. John's face was white with fatigue, sleeplessness, and regret. And yet he never gave in or complained or was other than cheerful to me and kind. So this is a man who saw his brother killed. This is a man who saw his first child lying motionless and dead in a crib. This is a man whose wife struggled with addiction painfully. This is a man who saw his best friend shot in the head and die in his hands. This is a man whose daughter was born with a tremendous disability and stood by her and loved her every day until he died. And this is a man who struggled through all of that, and even though through some of the most horrific times, stayed calm and cool and was a rock of strength. That's what makes a great leader. A great grand vision of what this country can be, the practical politics to make it a reality, and the personal strength and decency from such tragedy to make these things a reality. We have a sickness a little bit in our society. You know, everybody has demons. For one person, it's a learning disability. For other person, it's a tragedy. For some people, it's sexual abuse. For other people, it's alcoholism. You name it. We all have them. The definition of intimacy is when we decide in our own way to let people into our personal worlds and expose them to our weaknesses. We sometimes think in politics and life about how we're so tough, but we all have our challenges. John A. had his. The definition of intimacy is when you decide to invite somebody into that aspect of your life. And so often in our society, and this is the sickness, is we compare ourselves to people we know nothing about, we're sure that they're happier than us, have no demons, and we make ourselves feel miserable as a result. The great thing about Sir John A. Macdonald is the scholarship by organizations like Macdonald-Laurier who talk about people. Yes, they are great heroes, but they're not great heroes for the simplistic slogans. They're great heroes for the grand vision. They're great heroes for the practical politics. But they're also great heroes because we know so much about them because of your scholarship. John A. Macdonald is a great Canadian. He is the greatest Prime Minister in Canada's history. And Bob Plamondon put it so perfectly in his book. He said, Sir John A. Macdonald ranks head and shoulders above any leader of any party on the question of nation building. His triumph of confederation, expansion of territory and provinces across the continent, building the National Railroad, and the growth of diversity of Canada through expansionist immigration policies have made Macdonald our most accomplished nation builder. Macdonald has no equal. He did all that while at the same time having that personal character through remarkable tragedy, showing incredible personal and public leadership. He is the greatest. Thank you.